Alright, this video lecture begins our short unit of class on the problem of obedience. And the philosophical questions we're examining in this unit of class have to do with the rightness and wrongness of obeying authority. But we're exploring this question through the lens of psychology. Now, psychology is the study of mind and behavior, of both conscious and unconscious thought. Now, how a person thinks and behaves is always the result of an interaction between the person, their unique disposition, temperament, personality, and the person's environment, the unique situation they are in, their surroundings, which influence their perceptions and behaviors. Now, social psychologists, they argue that we often overestimate the importance of dispositional factors and underestimate the importance of situational factors. Social psychology recognizes the profound influence that situation and surroundings have on our behavior. Social psychology seeks to understand how a person's individual behavior is always being influenced by the social environment in which that behavior takes place. So, what are some of the factors just in our environments that influence how we behave? Well, first of all, there's the presence or absence of other people in that environment. The presence of others will make a difference in the choices we make and the actions that we take. You probably behave differently around your parents than around your friends. The people around you shape your thoughts and your feelings, your moods and your perceptions. And the way that we see other people and the way that we think they see us plays a powerful role in a wide variety of actions and decisions. So an early definition of social psychology is that it's the scientific study of how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, and implied presence of others. Of course, our environments don't only consist of other people, which influence us, but also of social norms and behavioral expectations that have been sort of established in the environment, established in that environment by other people, by institutions, by authorities, and by just traditions. There are routines and established patterns of life. There's a sort of normalized etiquette and a normalized dress code, a normalized set of values and desires. In other words, our environments often come sort of preloaded with a prefabricated script for how we are to behave, whether as a student in a classroom or a worker on the job site, a shopper or consumer in a retail store, a worshiper in church, a friend at a funeral service, a young person in a club, and also as a consensual participant in a scientific study. There is also, of course, the influence of group pressure and groupthink that can modify our behavior. And some sort of environments will exacerbate the pressure felt on an individual by groupthink more so than other environments. So Stanley Milgram is a social psychologist and the author of our reading for this unit of class. Milgram is one of the most important figures in the history of social psychology, and our reading was a short excerpt from his book, Obedience to Authority, published in 1974. In the text, Milgram discusses his obedience experiments, and he provides powerful explanations for the experiment's shocking results, pun intended. So, let's review how the obedience experiments actually worked. So, two people came into a psychology laboratory to take part in a study. They are told that this is a scientific study on memory. One person is designated as the teacher, the other person is designated as the learner. The learner, who is an actor, is taken into a room and seated in a chair. His arms are then strapped to prevent his movement, and then an electrode is attached to his wrist. The experimenter asks the learner to then memorize a list of different word pairs on which he will be tested. Then the teacher is taken into a different room and seated before a large and impressive shock generator. And the main feature of the machine is a line of 30 switches ranging from 15 to 450 volts. There are also verbal designations beneath the switches that range from slight shock to danger severe shock. And the teacher is instructed to read off one of the word pairs and then administer a shock each time the learner answers incorrectly. He's told to begin at the lowest level, the 15 volts, but then increase the voltage with each wrong answer that the learner gives. Now, the experimenter is also an actor. He functions as the authority figure in the experiment. He's dressed intentionally, so in his lab coat, he has his notepad, and he explains that the study will measure the effects of pain on memory. The focus of the experiment, of course, is the teacher. He's the actual subject of the experiment. He's the only non-actor in the whole study. And in reality, this is not a study of pain and its effect on memory. It's a study of obedience to authority. The shocks are totally fake, and the learner is never in any actual physical danger. Milgram himself observes the experiment in an unseen third room. Now, the purpose of the experiment is to see how far a person will proceed in a situation in which he or she is ordered to inflict increasing amounts of pain on an unwilling victim. In other words, the point of the experiment is to see at what point will the test subject, the teacher, refuse to obey the experimenter. To what extent will people obey orders from an unjust authority figure regardless of the consequences of obedience? In terms of the findings of the study, Milgram writes, "It is the extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority figure that constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." Later, Milgram comments on the fundamental lesson of the study, writing, "Ordinary people simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." Milgram further states, "Many subjects will obey the experimenter no matter how, or no matter the pleading of the person being shocked, no matter how painful the shock seemed to be, and no matter how much the victim pleads to be let out. This was seen time and again in our studies and has been observed in several universities where the experiment was repeated." Now, Milgram's initial hypothesis was that the test subject would stop shocking the learner at 150 volts. And remember, they go to like 450. And boy, was Milgram wrong. Turns out that 2/3 of the study participants continued to administer shocks labeled as fatal, despite the protests of the learner, who began to demand an end to the study. When commanded, they continued administering shocks even when the learner ceased to answer any of the questions and ceased to make any noise at all. As Philip Zimbardo states in the preface of the book, these ordinary adults were reduced to mindless, obedient school children who did not know how to exit from a most unpleasant situation until a teacher gives them permission to do so. So the results of the experiments are horrifying. Obedience like this is a tremendous problem, and it's a cause for extraordinary concern, both for you as an individual and for the world that you live in. Now, Milgram's obedience experiments were one of the earliest demonstrations of how profoundly obedient, how dangerously obedient, how unethically obedient ordinary people are. All right, so there's the question of how exactly to define obedience, right? What kind of psychological force is it exactly? And in the reading, Milgram defines obedience as the dispositional element that binds us to authority. It's an orientation to your environment and to yourself. It's a way of opening up to and responding to the situations that you find yourselves in. Of course, the authority that we are bound to through obedience in any given situation, it might be a good and a just authority, or it might be an unjust authority. It might be a legitimate authority, it might be an illegitimate authority. Sure, school teaches us how to obey authority, but how often does it give focus to teaching us how to distinguish critically the just authority from the unjust authority? And we can look back through history and we find that more crimes against humanity and more atrocities have been committed in the name of obedience than have ever been committed out of malice. As the philosopher Hannah Arendt says in her study of the Holocaust, the greatest evil in the world is the evil committed by nobodies. Milgram writes, similarly, the person who with inner conviction loathes stealing, killing, and assault may find himself performing these acts with relative ease when commanded by authority. In other words, behavior that is unthinkable in an individual who is acting on his own may be executed without hesitation when carried out under orders. So let's watch a brief clip of one of the experiments.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learn. Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man there. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in and see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
So, I mean, it's really uncomfortable to watch. I mean, you get the sense of how desperately he wants to get up and remove himself from the experiment. And he stands up over and over, but he keeps coming back, right? He keeps obeying. And he asks, like, are you going to take responsibility for that man in there? Refuses to accept responsibility for his own actions. He thinks he might be killing him. And he wants someone to go check on him, but he can't just make himself stop delivering the shocks and go check on the victim who he thinks he might have just killed. And when he's asked, who's going to take responsibility for this person, he's told by the experimenter, I'm responsible. But this is a question that we really need to ask. Who is responsible for the fact that the man in the other room is being shocked? Now, the most important theoretical concept that Milgram deploys to explain his test results is the agentic state. The agentic state is the state of mind in which one person allows other people to direct their behaviors. In other words, they pass responsibility for the consequences of their behavior and their actions onto the person who is directing them. The agentic state is the essence of obedience, according to Milgram. It consists in the psychological disposition of viewing oneself merely as the instrument for carrying out another person's wishes, where you no longer regard yourself as responsible for your own actions. And once this critical shift in consciousness has occurred, all of the other essential features of obedience follow, Milgram points out, right? Even the willingness to engage in cruel behavior. The explanations and the justifications expressed by the obedient person are essentially similar across different types of situations, whether they occur in a laboratory or in the control room of a missile silo. The person says, well, I was just following orders. Now, Milgram goes on to describe obedience as the psychological mechanism that links individual action to political purpose. And he's thinking of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. So it's not just that we have a tendency to obey individual authority figures, but obedience also binds us to entire systems of authority. So we're going to end the first lecture here, but I want you to kind of ponder a few reflective questions. The first is, what are some of the situational factors in a college classroom that influence your behavior? How are these factors similar to and different from your classrooms in high school? Was it wrong for protesters in the 1960s to disobey racial segregation laws? And was it wrong for protesters to disobey the police when the police showed up to enforce those segregation laws that were being broken? Also, should the police have enforced Jim Crow segregation laws simply because it was their job to do so? And if you're thinking on that one and you're thinking, well, it was their job, they had to, it was a different time, well, think on this question. Should the Nazi SS and the German police have enforced the Nuremberg laws? Most of us who might hesitate when it comes to the question about American police, the Jim Crow police, will not hesitate to say, oh, well, of course, the German police should have not enforced their laws, right? Happening right at the same time in the 1930s. And the Nuremberg laws, they were the racist and anti-Semitic laws enforced in Germany in the 1930s, right? These laws defined Jewish people as having, 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents. They excluded German Jews from German citizenship. They also took away rights from minorities, gay people, immigrants, so on. And they were enforced, right, by the German police. Do you think you would have disobeyed the authority, right, the experimenter? It's a difficult question. Most people think, yeah, I would. But then again, when we look at the statistics of the experiment, right, almost 70% of people obey. They don't resist. They don't disobey the experimenter. And the last kind of thought to think about this is that, the people in the experiment the test subjects weren't monsters, in other words, right? Milgram even points this out, right? Why do we miss the point if we simply judge the test subjects as monsters or sadists, right, who are, inflicting pain on helpless victims? Milgram writes, the problem is not that the test subjects don't know the difference between right and wrong. Many of the test subjects, at the level of stated opinion, feel quite as strongly as any of us about the moral requirement of refraining from action against the helpless victim. They, too, in general terms, know what ought to be done and can state their values when the occasion arises. But this has little, if anything, to do with their actual behavior under the pressure of circumstances. All right, so that'll conclude this lecture. I'll hope to have lecture 2 over the obedience experiments up soon. Thanks.